Hello everyone, Pastor Nathan Laska here with our next session of Bible study from Daniel. We're in chapter 3, the three men of the fiery furnace. Starting at chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officers assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. One of the questions that arises when we read this story and these selection of verses, where is Daniel? And so the correct answer to that question is we don't know. We certainly know he is not included. He is not named. This is not his story nor his narrative. He does not make an appearance in this chapter 3. Perhaps he is traveling. Perhaps he is in another region, a different region of the Babylonian Empire at this particular time. We don't know. We do know that Daniel shares what his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, have in this unwillingness to bow down to idols. We'll see that as the story goes forward. And later on in the book of Daniel, he is in the lion's den. He's thrown into the lion's den for refusing to compromise and refusing to disobey the words the Lord has spoken. So Daniel shares the sentiment. We just don't know where he is. The correct answer to some questions is, I don't know. Picking up at verse 4. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So the furnace is already constructed. That's already present. This enforcement has already been thought through. The command of Nebuchadnezzar, the command of these officials, everyone who hears this music must bow down and worship this statue. Going back to the dimensions of the statue, some people find it a little difficult to picture. 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. Archaeologically, there's been evidence found of a 15-foot platform in this region where we think this happened. Perhaps those 15 feet are included in the 90 feet of height, and that would make it scale a little better in our minds. Many people think and imagine that this is a statue of Nebuchadnezzar himself. It never says that. But remember how Babylon is this empire of many, many, many gods, many idols, and this pantheon of gods. Has one nation overtook another in war, that showed which god had the upper hand, and as war continued, it showed which god had the upper hand in this ranking and hierarchy and just pantheon of gods. That was the Babylon worship system. And here we have this statue and these commanding words. This is what you are commanded to do. You must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. It's not a arbitrary whatever command. This is enforced law. You must do this. Therefore, as soon as they heard it, they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music. All the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into the blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Do you catch the jealousy in the complaint that the other officials and governors had with Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego? There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Thinking of Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego's promotions that were advised by Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar did raise these three men up and place them into advanced positions. Perhaps there's a little bit of envy, a little bit of spite in this as these people come forward. Another question I have as we go through this story: what is the difference between what Nebuchadnezzar is commanding to be done and, say, a pledge of allegiance to a country? Quite a bit. There's quite a gulf of difference between a pledge of allegiance to a country and what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. It is very typical in the ancient world, and it's very typical now to blurry and muddy up the waters between political loyalty and religion. And Christianity does that too, but the pagan world does that just as frequently. We see that here. Emperor worship is very common. Very common in the New Testament. It's what the early century Christians put up with in the Roman Empire. They were accused of being enemies of a country, enemies of a nation, because they would not worship the emperor. They would not worship the Caesar. Nothing new under the sun. Here we see that going on in Babylon. And we're reminded of God's first commandments. You should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. What does this mean? We should fear and love God, that we do not worship and bow down to other gods. There's open idolatry and there is closed idolatry. There's hidden idolatry. We put it that way. Open idolatry would be the visible public things, the false religions that are out there, the religions that publicly gather and are formal and on paper and visible to the human eye. They worship something other than the triune God, the God of the Bible. But there's also closed, hidden idolatry as well. That's in the human heart, the thing that we can't see. When we put different things above in our rankings, above God, anything that sits on the throne of our heart that's other than the God who speaks to us in His Word, that is idolatry. And it can take many shapes. Maybe it's money, maybe it's pride, maybe it's a business, a job. It could be family, it could be wife and children. Anything that sits on the throne of one's heart except the God that speaks instead of the God that speaks to us in his word. And every time we disobey another one of God's commandments, any of God's commandments, automatically we are guilty of breaking this first commandment as well, because we are saying my way, not your way, to the Lord. So idolatry is going on, and it's more open here then. But we also got to talk about hidden idolatry as well, and that's a personal thing. God's law cuts pretty deep when we talk about those things. Back to the verses, verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Nebuchadnezzar certainly has a short memory, doesn't he? In the previous video, we talked through chapter 2, and what was his confession to Daniel? How the God of Daniel was the Lord of lords and King of kings. He is the God above all gods. Still not yet making the God of Daniel his God. Nebuchadnezzar's not there at that point, and he certainly has forgotten what he has spoken to Daniel just however long ago, relatively short amount of time. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Putting the Lord to the test, we could say. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it. And he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not," I love that. I think that's beautiful. It's amazing. An amazing confession of faith here in chapter 3, verse 18. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Wow. It's an intense confession of faith. Do we worship the Lord just because we think it's going to make life easier? It's going to get us out of the tight spaces and jams we find ourselves in life. Is that why we worship the Lord? Or do we worship the Lord because he's the Lord? He is the God that is, the true God, the only one. When we believe what he says, we take his promises to heart. May we stand with Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego and give this confession of faith. Even if God does not act or save in an earthly way, even if the worst case scenario comes to pass and unfolds that way, even if God does not, it doesn't change anything. He was and is able to save his eternal promises. We're still clinging to them. Promises of forgiveness of sins, life, and salvation in Christ. This world is temporary. It's the world to come, and our heavenly home that we keep in mind. That is our true home. We are but strangers here. Even if God does not, we want you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. And now we see Nebuchadnezzar overreacting. He's a very volatile man, Nebuchadnezzar. They've pressed his buttons in a certain way. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Nebuchadnezzar's mad. He's been ticked, irritated. He's seeing red. Maybe the 7 times hotter than it normally is. Maybe that's just a way of saying as hot as it possibly could go. These furnaces were likely, air would come into these furnaces from the side. The people that were dropped in from the top. Perhaps they used a substance called naphtha, which makes fire burn much hotter and much more intense than normal. They knew about that stuff back then. Some combination of those things. Nebuchadnezzar is trying to make a point. He's not thinking straight. Strongest soldiers has them tie them up and throw them in, and the strongest soldiers die. Look, think of what Nebuchadnezzar's rage gets him and what he loses. And think of how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are dressed, wearing robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, all the fuel for this fire that's going in. I wonder what's going to happen. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." The only thing that gets burnt up is the bindings for their hands and feet. Perhaps there's a morbid curiosity in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar. I even want to see this. And he's sitting down and he's going to watch the show. These 3 men who won't bow down and worship an idol. He wants to see them burnt to a crisp. They fall into the furnace. The soldiers are dead. But these 3 men still alive, still alive, still alive. And then all of a sudden, there's 4 men in this furnace. They're walking around. And this 4th man, he looks like one of the sons of the gods. There's something different about him. It's an interesting fact. Interesting piece of this story. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening for the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God." And he brings that back. "Come out. Come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. What an amazing miracle. Not a hair on their head was singed. No fire damage to any piece of skin, piece of flesh. Their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. You know how just sitting around a campfire for 5 minutes, you can't get rid of that smell. Not here. There was no smell of fire on them. This miracle is just compounded and amazing. What happens? Verse 28, we'll finish here. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut to pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. These royal advisors that were out to get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are now witnesses of this amazing miracle. And Nebuchadnezzar again changes his tune. He's back to the point that he was at the end of chapter 2. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He is the God of all gods. He is above all. He's willing to say that. Anyone who speaks against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their houses should be turned into piles of rubble. They should be cut to pieces. Kind of intense. It's this mixed bag of just overkill and zeal and authoritarianism with what we would call civic righteousness that is we see in the public. People who don't believe in God, and we still wouldn't call Nebuchadnezzar a believer in the true God. He's not saying this is my God too. He's just putting up these rules and parameters and saying that the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he's above all the other ones. But civic righteousness is where we see people who don't believe, not Christians, unbelievers, but they're willing to do uh, good civil things in the eyes of people. Helping an old lady across the street. Many people in government, they want to govern their people well, not because they're believers, but just because their conscience and their natural knowledge of God compels them. It's very different than Christianity. But the Christian church and believers, we also appreciate this civic righteousness rather than flagrant unbelief and persecution. We would say it's better. But we don't call Nebuchadnezzar a believer here. He's not. God blesses Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego through this. The king promoted them. They are able to serve in an even higher capacity now. The exiles of God's people that are in Babylon and throughout the empire. God working in mysterious ways. So when to rebel against a government and when not? When do we say with Paul in Romans chapter 13, submit to the government, for they are God's servant to do you good? That's in the Bible too. And when do we say we must obey God rather than men? I think this is a story that really helps us wade those waters and those thoughts. when the government would explicitly say you must do something that is contrary to the commands of God, that's where we would say something like we must obey God rather than men. We also aren't revolutionary starters, war starters. We're not there to upset the apple cart or rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. But we still don't compromise. We are not to compromise. Bow down and worship other gods regardless of what they might be. There's one God, the Lord of all, the one who sent his one and only Son, Jesus, to suffer and die for the sins of the world, the one who rose again, the Lord of life. And he will protect and guard his people in this age and in the life to come. God's blessings to you. May God's peace be with you.